My name is Kimi Jackson and I'm the director of ProBar. ProBar provides legal services to children who are detained in the Rio Grande Valley in South Texas. We've been providing these services for more than a decade and we've developed special expertise in the field. You're about to watch a video that will give you skills to work with a special population of Central American children, and I hope that you find this information helpful.
Today I'm going to be talking to you about working with Central American children. And this presentation is primarily about children from Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, and those are the three countries that most of the children who you'll be screening and providing Know Your Rights presentations come from. Before we begin, I just want to give you a few notes about the presentation. Most of the information included comes from first-hand experience and observations over years of working with this population of children. The idea of the presentation is to give you a general overview of the situation, but we'd ask you to remember that each child is unique and each has a unique situation. The goal is also to help identify what may be some unexpected characteristics that you'll find when working with Central American children, and finally to create awareness of possible conflicts that may arise when U.S. professionals are working with children from this population. Don't be discouraged if you've never worked with children from Central America before. Most of the children you meet will be excited that someone wants to listen to their story, and they'll be happy to have the opportunity to share their history and a little bit of themselves with you. So here is a map of Central America, and as you can see, the three countries we'll be talking about are at the northern end, and they're known as the Northern Triangle. During the presentation, I'll review both similarities and differences among the three countries. And I'll start by going over each country individually. The second portion of the presentation will talk about regions that span the three countries. And then finally, we'll look at how these different topics and contexts affect the children who you'll be working with. All right, so we'll begin with Honduras. Honduras is notable because it has the highest percentage of its population living below the poverty line of the three countries that we'll be talking about, and it's 60% of the population that lives at or below the poverty line. The other reason that it stands out is that it has the world's highest intentional homicide rate, with over 90 homicides per 100,000 people in the country. To give you a little context, Mexico, that number is 24, and the United States, it's only 5. And although the entire country of Honduras is high at 90, San Pedro Sula, the rate is even higher with 169 intentional homicides per 100,000 people. So a lot of the children who we'll be working with are very familiar with violence and they've seen a lot of traumatic events. And then the last two statistics here are control of corruption and rule of law. And as you can see, they're very low. And this also factors into the children who you'll be working with in that they're not comfortable going to police because they're not able to do anything in their countries. And you'll see that a lot of these statistics are very similar for the other two countries that we'll be talking about today. So next up, I'll give you just three main factors that sort of affect the reasons that children migrate. So first is Hurricane Mitch, which even though it occurred 15 years ago, it severely damaged the infrastructure in Honduras, and it's really hindered development in the country as well. And then a coup in 2009 hindered development even more. And then another major factor is the increased drug and gang violence. Both narco violence or drug violence that are from cartels who have been pushed south from Mexico, as well as street gangs. The most common are the 18th Street Gang and the Mara Salvatrucha, known as the MS-13. And those gangs and the narco violence as well are present in all three countries. Next is El Salvador. El Salvador has nearly, or just over 1/3 of the population living at or below the poverty line, and it has the 4th highest rate of intentional homicide in the world. El Salvador is it's actually smaller than the state of Massachusetts. And then finally, I just want to show that control of corruption and rule of law numbers are again better than Honduras, but still very low. So some factors that affect children migrating from El Salvador. The Civil War, which lasted from 1980 to 1992. And again, although it was over 20 years ago, it affected the country in such a way that it's still having after effects today. As I mentioned, it is a very small country, and it is in fact the smallest and most densely populated country in Central America. And the reason that this affects the children that you'll work with is that the gangs are hard to escape. So the 18th Street Gang and the MS, who I mentioned before, if a children tries to flee them by moving to another part of the country, it's very difficult to get away from them. And 66% of the children in a recent report by the UNHCR from El Salvador said that fleeing organized crime was their primary motivator for leaving the country. The next factor is that over 20% of the population lives abroad. This affects children in that nearly 40% of children in El Salvador live without one or both of their parents. That's for reasons of migration, can be abandonment, or death. Next, we'll move on to Guatemala. Guatemala is the most populous country in Central America, and it's unique because by some estimates, up to 50% of the population is indigenous. And within that population, 50% are also, of the entire population of Guatemala, living at or below the poverty line. And it also has a very high rate of intentional homicide. It's 5th in the world, right behind El Salvador. And then once again, just to point out, the control of corruption and rule of law are again very low. So factors in Guatemala that affect the children. Again, another civil war, which was a 36-year-long civil war from 1960 to 1996. And again, although it happened a long time ago, 200,000 people were killed and over 1 million displaced. So even if the children themselves weren't born when the war was taking place, their families, friends, community members were all affected by the war, and it continues to have effects in the country today. The next factor is displaced drug violence. And the displaced is in there again because this is drug violence that's moving south from Mexico. So a lot of the cartels who are getting squeezed out of Mexico are setting up in Guatemala, in the northern border, but also in other regions as well. And then there has been a series of natural disasters that have hit the country, including earthquakes, landslides, volcanoes, and hurricanes. And although the entire country has been affected, it's really been strongest in the Department of San Marcos, and you'll probably see a lot of children who come from that region of the country. With Guatemala, I want to talk a little bit more about the indigenous cultures, because as I mentioned, by some estimates, they're up to 50% of the population. But with that said, remember that not all Guatemalans are indigenous. 50% are, 50% are not. And it's really easy to assume that most Guatemalans are of Mayan descent, but that's not actually true. And not all indigenous are Guatemalan. Although we didn't include a slide in the presentation today, both El Salvador and Honduras also have indigenous populations. And the most common who you might run into who aren't indigenous Guatemalan will be the Garifuna. And there's up to 600,000 Garifuna living throughout Honduras, Guatemala, and Belize. When working with indigenous children, it's really important to avoid idealizing. Their culture is very different from the mainstream culture, and a lot of the children who will come in are going to be shorter than your average child. They have round faces. They're generally very smiley, and that may be from not understanding what you're saying, so they smile and nod more frequently. And it's very easy to get sort of a glowing view. And so we just ask you to remember that they're coming from cultures that also have both victims and perpetrators, just like every culture. And so it's important to keep that in mind. And then the final piece on this slide is that in rural areas, which is the area where the indigenous population is concentrated in Guatemala, those areas have the lowest income and the lowest levels of education and literacy. So that means that a lot of the Guatemalan indigenous population is very low levels. So the indigenous population is very varied. There are over 20 Mayan languages spoken in Guatemala, plus Garifuna and Xinca, which are two distinct languages. Quiche is the largest ethnic group, comprising 9% of the total population of Guatemala, not just the indigenous population. And Mam and Quiche are the two indigenous languages most often requested in immigration court. And so what that tells you is that the children who you'll be screening and giving presentations to, those will be the two languages that you might want to have interpreters ready for if that's a service that you can find. Those are the two languages to look for. Well, Mum is unique among the Indigenous languages in that it actually has various dialects even within Mum, and they're not mutually intelligible. So you may have a child who speaks Mum from the Department of Quetzaltenango and a child who speaks Mum from the Department of San Marcos, but they can't understand one another. So when you're looking for an interpreter for a Mum-speaking child, you really want to focus on what region that interpreter is coming from, as well as the region that the child came from, to make sure they can understand one another. And listen to the beginning of the interpretation and ask the child if they understand the interpreter, and let them know it's okay if they don't. And as I mentioned on the previous slide with education, children who are Indigenous, they may speak Spanish and their Indigenous language, or they may be monolingual in either, but generally they have a much lower level of education. Less than 40% of children in rural Guatemala complete primary school. So not even making it to high school, but less than 40% complete elementary school. And children who come into the shelters or to wherever it is that you'll be screening them, they may have learned Spanish on their journey to the United States or while they've been in the shelter. And so you might think that they know, it might appear that they know a lot more Spanish than they actually do, or have a better ease with writing and reading. And it's because they've been asked the same questions and asked to answer the same things over and over again. So that basic information they have down, and they can probably answer very fluidly, very easily. But when you veer off those basic questions, like what's your name, why you came, you may notice that the answers don't quite make as much sense, or maybe you'll get a yes or no answer to a question that wasn't a yes or no question. So really look out for that. Encourage the child to tell you all of the languages they speak, and be very positive about speaking more than one language. There's often a lot of shame associated with being Indigenous in Guatemala, and the children may hesitate to disclose their identity because of that shame, and they might not know how you'll react. And then there's generally a bigger distrust of outsiders in the Indigenous community, so it may take you a little longer to build up confidence or a trust with a child than it would with other children who you're screening. Central American children are very diverse. You'll work with children of all different colors who speak many different languages, and some come from rural environments and others from urban environments. Now we'll begin the next portion of the presentation, which is reviewing the different regions that span the 3 countries we've been talking about. So the first region is the Tropical Caribbean Strip, and it includes the ports of Guatemala and the northern coast of Honduras. It's the most productive and economically diversified region, and it's the home of banana companies and banana plantations, and also factories known as maquilas. And so because a lot of these plantations and factories have owners who are not Honduran, there's been a lot of outside influence in the region, and also a lot of intermigration. People from other parts of Honduras and Guatemala have moved to the northern coast because that's where the jobs are. But interestingly, there's no political power located in the region. So you have a lot of people moving north, but there's no capital. There's no seat of power for these countries in that region. So here are some photos from the Tropical Caribbean Strip. And as you can see, it's not what you might imagine when you think of Central America. It looks a little more Caribbean. And so some of the children who you'll talk to who come from this strip may have, I don't know if more of a Caribbean feel is the right way to say it, but you'll notice a difference for the children from this region. Next is the Central-mountainous strip. And this region includes most of Guatemala, El Salvador, and central Honduras. The central governments of all 3 countries are located in this region, and it contains both cultural headquarters and military headquarters, as well as agricultural regions with a lot of subsistence farming. The major cities are located here, as I mentioned, the capitals, but there's also a lot of isolated villages. Because it is a mountainous region, it's been difficult to build roads historically, and even today there are some villages that are hard to reach. And so this has led to sort of a divided region. You have the powerful elite who live in the cities, and then this disempowered majority, both the poor in the cities as well as the isolated subsistence farmers in the more rural areas. And then here are some images from the Central-mountainous strip, both the urban centers as well as farming. And then the next slide shows you the protests. A lot of the protests during the Civil War and even currently are taking place in this region because that's where the capitals are located. And the third region is the Pacific Coast Strip. This is the southern coast of El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, and it's the smallest geographic region of the 3. It's home to fishing and shrimp farms. There's drier and hotter temperatures than other regions. And the farming methods have been non-sustainable, and so they're losing a lot of natural resources. And this has, along with other things, has resulted in a loss of population and a lot of intermigration to other regions, both the capitals and then that northern coast. The past I've mentioned before with the civil wars and the problems that have affected these countries. However, it's important to keep in mind that most of the children who we will be working with don't know as much about the civil wars that their countries went through. They know that they happened, but they don't have the details, and it's not something that's very prevalent in their lives right now. It's not something that they view as an important factor for why they're coming or things that are going on in their lives. What's more prevalent as far as violence and things like that are the organized crime, the street gangs, and the drug violence that's being pushed south from Mexico. And so the bullet points on this slide really refer to that, how maybe the past has affected the present, but this present is the reality that the children you're screening will be dealing with. This sort of will bring the statistics that I mentioned earlier into how it really affects the children who you'll be screening today. The slide is labeled present versus past, and the first point is talking about the Cold War and the civil wars in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, along with U.S. deportations of gang members over the past 25 years, and how these have heavily contributed to having an armed population with very high unemployment rates. And so that feeds into a lot of the organized crime that's very prevalent in these countries. There's also been an increased availability of cell phones and internet and money sending services. And although these are great for children who have parents in the United States and making it easier to have communication, they've also been used as tools by these same street gangs and cartels, and they're tools of criminality and terror as well as communication between families. And finally, the past and the present situations have led to sort of a tsunami of narcotráfico or drug violence, which has never been seen before in this region. And it's led to this region, which I mentioned is known as the Northern Triangle, to be called one of the most violent regions in the world. And that's even taking into consideration active war zones. And officials, as I mentioned with those figures of the corruption and rule of law, are unable to combat the violence, which is just leading to no options for some of these children but to flee. Keep in mind, there may be many misconceptions about what life is like for children in Central America. We just ask you to keep an open mind and really listen to each individual child's story and listen to their background and their history rather than letting those other factors get in the way of finding out what the child's life has truly been like. And once again, this is another graph of the homicide rates, but it just sort of shows you the level of homicide that are present in these countries. So as you can see, Honduras, the rate is much higher than the second highest country, and then El Salvador and Guatemala at 4 and 5. So this combination of factors of violence, both organized crime and familial violence, weak economies, and this desire for family reunification are the three main push factors for children coming to the United States. And it will be very common to have a combination of the three. Maybe all three are motivators, one primarily, but others as well, but it's usually some sort of, or almost always some sort of combination. And what you'll almost always hear from every child is that they want a better life. It might take different forms. They're looking for education, they're looking for more work opportunities, but they're all coming for a better life. So the next slide switches a little bit, but we're going to talk more specifically about the children who you'll be screening. And this is touched on more in depth in another portion of the presentation, the screening presentation, but it also relates to the fact that the children are Central American. So in general, Central American children, as compared to US children, begin to work at a much younger age, especially the children from rural areas begin working in the fields as young as 6 and 7 years old. They may have more household responsibilities, and they're more frequently exposed to pain, violence, threats, death, and not just on television like American children may be, but in real life on their street. Their neighbor may have been murdered, or a parent or a family member. And then finally, they've often received fewer years of formal education than their counterparts, US American teens. And this next photo or image shows you the poverty levels, education levels, and population of all of Central America. And I know it's a little hard to see, so I'll read you the average years of school for the 3 countries we're talking about. El Salvador has the highest average at 7.7 years of school, then Honduras at 6.5 years of school, and the average years of school for a child from Guatemala is 4, which means most Guatemalan children don't even complete elementary school. And so this next slide goes a little more in depth on that education piece. Nearly 40% of Central American children leave high school before graduation. And the number, this is for all of Central America, and so the number for the 3 countries we're talking about is actually probably higher than this 40%. And even though primary education is free, families must pay for school supplies for the children, and they have to pay for transportation if the child doesn't live within walking distance. So a lot of students, even if they could attend school for free, they don't have the notebooks or the pencils or a way to get there, which causes children to either never go to school or to drop out after a few years. Another thing that's fairly common is that older siblings will drop out of school in order to work and pay for their younger siblings. A high percentage of children, especially in rural Guatemala, aren't at grade level. And this is due to the factors that I mentioned previously. They may start school late, or they may go for a few years, have to drop out, and then repeat a grade. And so it's not uncommon for you to speak to children who of varying ages who may all be in the same grade at school. This has become a more recent problem, but many children, especially those living in urban areas, have had to leave schools due to increasing gang violence. And this is both gang violence in their schools and in the communities surrounding the schools. And it's just become unsafe for them to attend school, and they've had to drop out. So another major difference between different countries in Central America is this urban versus rural difference. And this will span all 3 countries. So an urban child from El Salvador is more likely to be similar to an urban child from Guatemala than an urban and rural child from the same country. So urban children generally tend to be more fun-seeking, or they're used to more what we would consider your normal teenager, while a child from a rural area is much more prudent. They're thinking about work. They're thinking about buying land to build a house for their family. There's this idea of self-improvement, doing things to make yourself better, versus self-sacrifice, doing things to improve the lives of your family members. And then there's the deficient, non-productive education, which is typically a rural Guatemalan or Salvadoran may think that getting an education is just not being productive, and being productive may mean that you're illiterate. And then there's also this childlike versus adult-like between urban and rural. And finally, the influence of the media will be stronger on urban children, and influence of community and family ties is stronger for the rural children. And again, these are just generalizations. Each child will be distinct, but it's good to have this background sort of information on the rural and urban distinctions. So when you're interacting with children from Central America, there's some things to keep in mind. First is that they're very different from Latino children living in the United States for all of the reasons that I mentioned in the previous slides. Also, they'll identify more as their country of origin, so it's more common to say, I'm Guatemalan, than Hispanic or Latino. Often they're very unaware of how geographically big and culturally diverse the United States is. They may know that they're going to Virginia, but they have no idea where it's located, if it's a city or a state. It's just not been a part of their reality up until now. And finally, the last piece on this slide is that a lot of the information they do have from the United States may have come from action or comedy movies, which have been translated into Spanish. The next slide, questioning older people is often considered disrespectful. And this is important in screenings because it's really important to encourage the children to let you know if you've gotten something wrong, because they're not going to want to tell you for fear that they'll seem disrespectful. So it's important to encourage the children to let me know if I get something wrong, if I didn't repeat something back to you correctly. And again, this will be gone into in more depth in the screening portion of the presentation. The next factor is that complaining is a sign of ungratefulness and disrespect. And this may factor in that the children don't want to tell you their whole story, or may make things sound not quite as bad as it really was, because they don't want to come off as complaining about their country or their family or their situation in general. Often they haven't been raised to verbalize thoughts and feelings, so it's important to give the kids time to think about things and different ways to phrase things or ways to ask questions in order to elicit this information. And the final piece on this slide is that often the children aren't used to apologizing or taking things back when admitting fault is avoided at all costs. So how this factors in is if a child does say something wrong or does do something that they feel uncomfortable with, they're unlikely to say anything and will just try to ignore it. And so it's another reason it's really good to encourage the children to ask questions and let them know that we all make mistakes and that it's okay, and that you want them to let you know if they have or if you have. Some issues that may come up as conflicts are that children, due to the culture, due to where they're coming from, may make comments that to you sound racist, sexist, or even homophobic. And so it's important to address those issues, but keep in mind the cultural context that the child is coming from. Another idea or factor is that the children are coming from systems that often don't work. So they also come with this belief that systems don't work, and the only people who benefit from them are the rich and the powerful. So they're expecting corruption, they're expecting manipulation and some sort of bribing. So it may be difficult for a child to believe that they can actually benefit from a system that's in place. And often you'll hear children are nervous about going to court or nervous about going to appointments with immigration because they're not used to the system working, they don't know what will happen, and they don't think that it could be beneficial for them. So it's very important to go over the importance of participating in systems with the children. Finally, living and working in the United States undocumented is the norm for most of the family members or friends of these children. And so it may be difficult for the children and their family members to believe that they can get papers, that they can have some benefit at the end of this system, even if they don't have money, even if they don't know someone higher up. And so it's important to explain step by step how the process works and how the child may be able to benefit from it. And this final slide on communication, just things to look for when you're working with these Central American children. Ask about every possible person in a situation, then try to understand the consequences or causes. If you don't quite understand something, ask for more details, because a lot of times something may seem very normal to the child, but it's really quite confusing to you, and it's okay to ask for those details to get a better idea of the picture. You'll really want to double check terms. If you don't quite understand what something means, instead of nodding and thinking I'll figure this out later, you really want to check with the child what they mean by that word. And it's because words have different meanings not only in different countries but also in different regions, and sometimes a child makes up their own meaning for a word, or they're using it in a way that's not normal. So you really want to get that definition from the child themselves. So for example, the word pisto. In Central American countries, it's money, but in Mexico, it means drinking. And so if you're familiar with Mexican Spanish, you will be very confused when a child refers to the pisto that they paid to buy something. So this goes back to why it's important to ask a child if you understood something correctly and have them sort of summarize, or you summarize and have them check that for you. If a child says something that doesn't make sense, for example, they went outside and started washing the dishes, rather than assuming the child is crazy or they're lying to you, get some context. It's very common in Central America for the place to wash dishes or the bathroom even to be outside. So things like that, just try to get the context, ask the children to explain, because the situation may be very different than from what you're accustomed to. And the last piece on this slide is that children often don't self-advocate for themselves. They may describe very horrific scenes, murders, threats, with little or no affect, or using words that really don't reflect the gravity of the situation. And it's not because you're dealing with a child that has no emotion, but it's because they may have become numbed to these events, or just so used to traumatic events that they don't express that emotion. They have no tears left to cry. And so that, just keep that in mind as you're asking the children these questions that, and also you may be the fifth person to have interviewed them, and so they may have told this story over and over and over again. So keep that in mind when you're asking some of those more difficult questions. So thank you for watching this presentation, and I would really encourage you to watch the other two parts of the presentation, the section on screening and providing Know Your Rights presentations. Really hope that this was useful for you and wish you the best of luck.